What does it mean to bear witness? And what responsibilities come with doing so? What is cultural erasure? What is the role of the poet today? And how can poetry help us to better understand and negotiate some of the most complex issues of our time? Inspired by our remarkable repository of Armenian materials, from manuscripts to books to periodicals to a vast database of digital content, we've called upon one of the most critical minds of our time, Peter Balakian, to help us answer some of these questions. I'm Lenisa Kitchener, Chief of the African and Middle Eastern Division of the Library of Congress. This is your library. This is the nation's library. This is the Library of Congress. Thank you for joining us, and let's begin.
Today, we are having a conversation with poet Peter Balakian on cultural erasure, witness, and the poet. Peter Balakian is the author of 8 books of poems, including Ozone Journal, which won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for Poetry, and Ziggurat, both published by the University of Chicago Press. His most recent book, No Sign, wrestles with national, global, cultural, and political realities, including challenges for the human species amid planetary transmutation and the impact of mass violence on the self and culture. He is Donald M. and Constance H. Raybar Professor of the Humanities in the Department of English at Colgate University. Today's program includes a reading by Peter Balakian, followed by a discussion on cultural erasure and the role of the poet.
So I want to start with a couple of poems that deal with a history that's had a big impact on my work over decades now, and that is the history of the Armenian Genocide and my own family's experience in that event. The idea that trauma does get transmitted across generations is a very live idea for many writers, poets, fiction writers, and so on. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was the only survivor of a large, prosperous family from Diyarbakir, southeast Turkey, Ottoman Empire, historic Armenia. Everyone in her family was killed in the first week of August of 1915 at the height of the massacres and deportations that constituted the Armenian Genocide. The Turkish killing squads ran through her town and city, and she and her infant daughters survived a deportation, a death march. Her first husband did not. So I want to read 2 poems with my maternal grandmother, Nafina. Her name then, Shekhar Lamedjan. Her name in the USA was Arusian. This is called The Road to Aleppo, and it's an early poem. I wrote this poem 40 years ago. It appeared in my second collection, Sad Days of Light. Road to Aleppo, 1915. A grandson trying to imagine his grandmother's horrific genocidal experience. A flame like a leaf eaten in the sun followed you. A white light rose higher than the mountain and singed the corner of your eye when you turned to find the screaming trees dissolving to the plain. Even when the sun dropped, the ground was heat and bayonets, and in the Turkish wind, the throats of boys kept ringing in your ears. Your breath, like horizon, settled into black. You stuttered every mile to your daughter's shorter steps. The air, almost gone, filled inside your dress. The majority of survivors of the Armenian Genocide were women and children. More than 1 million Armenians were killed. Another million plus were brutally deported. So many of the able-bodied men were massacred first. So women and children could survive. And my grandmother and her infant daughters, toddler daughters as the years went on, lived in the famine-ravaged refugee quarter of Aleppo, Syria, finally obtaining the resources to get out. And this poem commemorates their coming to the USA through that famous threshold, Ellis Island. And this poem is called Ellis Island. The tide's a Bach cantata. The beach is the swollen neck of Isaac. The tide's a lamentation of white opals. The beach is free. The Coke machine rusted out. Here's everything you'll never need. Hemp cords, curry combs, jade and musk, a porcelain cup blown into the desert, stockings that walked to Syria in 1915. On the rocks, some ewes and rams graze in the outer dark. The manes of the shoreline undo your hair. A sapphire ring is fingerless. The weed and algae are floating like a bed, and the bloodless gulls, whose breaths would stink of all of us if we could kiss them on the beaks, are gnawing on the dead. I always feel that history lives in you, and that history always brings you to the present. You're not in the past. You're bringing history into the present to make it a dynamic dialectic that enables readers to understand the complexity of where we are now. And so I want to read this poem that deals with a history of the 1960s, a decade in which I came of age. It's prompted by and becomes a kind of meditation on an Andy Warhol silkscreen, one of his early disaster silkscreens, electric chair. He did a series of his electric chair images. They were to commemorate what was to be the last capital punishment act at the Sing Sing prison in New York State. This is called Warhol Electric Chair 63. Brings me into history and history back into me in the present. The red spreads like Christmas wrapping. The green, a field and a Caucasian rug. It's almost beautiful without the metal plates for the head, though the plug on the floor is visible. Before decorator colors and Hockney, Calvin Klein in the summery Hamptons, before there were switches to break the flow. My mother used to say, never touch a radio when you're in the bathtub. Never fly a kite near transmission lines. But still, it's furniture. Still, it's a typical American way to go. It's Sing Sing, the silhouette of Ethel Rosenberg. In the rheostatic air, the absent man heard, "She loves you." The British invasion and the flat line arrived at once. Outside, Negroes were eaten by dogs. Johnson was sworn in. Cuba turned red in the Green Sea. And this last poem I'd like to read is from my new book, No Sign. It's called History Bitterness. And I would say it's a poem about strange intersections and displacements. I did once come into a telephone booth with a friend and talk briefly to James Baldwin near the end of his life. I was at a artist colony, the great artist colony, Yaddo in Saratoga Springs. And Baldwin remains one of my heroes, and my friend knew that, and she wanted me to get on the phone, and I did. So that is what prompts this meditation. I also want to note that my great uncle, who was a bishop in the Armenian church, wrote an extraordinary survivor, Armenian Genocide survivor memoir. And he later was at the Paris Peace Treaty representing Armenia, that a nation struggling to be after World War I. History, bitterness. A phone booth, August, Yarrow, Saratoga Springs. Air of the Tiffany parlor, sour scent of empty wine bottles. My friend handed me the sweating receiver. Go ahead, say hello. What could I say to James Baldwin, who was dying in the south of France? No name in the street. Paris, Algiers, Little Rock. You can fill it in. I'm sitting in Les Deux Magots with my NY Yankees umbrella in my lap, a wide glass of wine from some vineyard of Burgundy in my hand, recalling that Baldwin sat here drinking scotch all day and writing as friends dropped by. And it hits me, just over Pont de Sully, my great uncle sat in a big treaty room in 1919 representing Armenia. Did it exist? In a fancy hotel with others who hoped for a nation in return for the slaughter. Baldwin knew Sartre and de Beauvoir. He saw Camus pass by. It was 1958, and the Algerian cabbie who dropped him off drunk on the curb was half blind from the revolution. Bang, bang, bang goes the heart. Mr. Baldwin was dying in a sensual village in the south of France. After a week at Versailles, my uncle came to that hotel room where in the closet of his head, a big white sheet floated over the Black Sea. What did rape and massacre mean? Fail-proof, shattered, bitten off, words that floated over the bridge into the carnival horns of night. A few months earlier, Miles Davis passed Baldwin at Les Deux Magots on his way to play for Louis Malle's En Censure pour l'Échafaud. The spurting air of love, 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 slipping from the valves, the spit and breath of night in Paris off the torpid brown Seine where Paul Celan had disappeared not long before. Hiss, hiss, hiss goes the heart. It's 1958, and Camus still walks the boulevard. The war in Algeria is daily acid in the river. What are degrees of separation? Private myths, illusions. My aunt, the surrealist, might call them chance meetings. Do we invent proximities for our need, for salvation, for love? Wilson, Clemenceau, Lloyd George, names my uncle scrawled on a map of the dispossessed, on a wall in a hotel of cards where Dixieland horns played at a banquet for the Grande Armée. And the next map of Europe was shuffled with an ace in the hole. Miles Davis spent several hours with Louis Malle making some languid, piercing, hollow, sliding sounds in the indeterminate dank night. No name on the street stalked him. A few years later, Baldwin moved just miles from where my father was born in Istanbul. A few years after the Armenians were expunged from Turkey, and my grandparents left the ghost map on the wall. It was 1919, and the flu blew along Saint-Germain, where my grandparents met my uncle that fall. I knew Baldwin's heart went hollow, languid, and sizzled with the need to get out of America. It even led him to the place my grandparents fled before they landed a couple miles from Baldwin's apartment in Harlem. Are these degrees of separation, or just my way of thinking about that strange moment in a phone booth at an artist colony in the summer of '86? My friend said, if you love Jimmy's work, I know he'd love to hear from you. All good news means a lot, especially at the end. What could I say to Mr. Baldwin? He'd helped me understand the bitter history that had trapped me, that was trapped in me. Istanbul, New York, Paris, no name, no street. I was sweating into the phone. Mr. Baldwin's voice was frail but unmistakable.
Let's start with that bitter history. You mention in that poem your grandparents, your great uncle, whose memoir you have translated. Can you talk about how their lives and their experiences have shaped your writing, particularly your grandmother, who figures prominently in both your memoir, Black Dog of Fate, and also your poetry?
Yeah, well, I do believe that history comes to us often in very personal ways, that our ancestors experience. And if you're a poet, if you're an artist of any kind, traumatic experiences of family in earlier generations can really come to haunt you. And the figures, your grandmother, your grandfather, those who have survived traumatic experiences can really come to inform your own imagination and your connection to a large historical event. In this case, that event that we've been discussing here happens to be the genocide of the Armenians, all mass killed by the Turkish government behind the screen of World War I. That event happened decades before my life, and yet I come along when I do. And that history is as alive as ever, in the way that the imagination grabs just a filament of it, because we can't pretend we are writing epic histories. We're just grabbing the threads that ignite us and animate me, and not only animate my imagination, they have to animate your language. Because in the end, poets live and die by what they do with their language. So that those ancestors can come and help me my own journey as a poet, both with my materials, meaning my language and its cadences and rhythms and pulsations and images, as well as with the big issues I'm interested in, is a powerful thing. And so once you start plugging in to those vibes, they can take you to very interesting places, and you never quite know when they are when they're going to pop up, because they can pop up in your late 20s, in your mid 40s, they can pop up in your mid 60s, and in the case of my maternal grandmother, who survived the death march with her 2 infant daughters, she has really been an animating force in my life, and I'm very, I feel very blessed by that strange irony because of the suffering and torment she went through. I wish it weren't so in any way, but being what it is, artists come along in later generations, and if they're compelled by those stories and by those events, then they find themselves writing about them.
Speaking of places that they take you, right? You've No Sign and also your earlier work have also been opportunities for you to go back to some of these places. I can think of Aleppo, I can think of Istanbul, these places that are so intimately connected with the crime and its aftermath, survival, revival. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's particularly interesting, complex, when you're part of a diasporan culture. For example, if you live in the US and you're African American or you're Native American, you have been on this soil for centuries, and therefore your relationship to everything in the present is charged in ways that are so different than if you're a diasporan person with a traumatic history, the crimes happened over there, you know, and now you get a chance to return to scenes of crimes that you've imagined your whole life. And these become really quite forbidding types of journeys. And sometimes, I mean, it took me a long time to feel comfortable even thinking about going to Turkey, you know, because the brutality that successive regimes of the Turkish government have perpetrated on Armenian Christians, Greek Christians, Assyrian Christians, Jews, Kurds, is so bloody and deep that one sees that land through such a dark and problematic lens, and one doesn't go back there blithely or easily. It took me a long time to finally feel it was safe for me to return. And when I did return, you know, I felt uncomfortable. Only good friends on the ground, wonderful Turkish people, scholars, writers, who've given their own lives for democracy, have made my voyages to Turkey possible and comfortable. And so returning is a feeling of being haunted in a way. The ghosts of the past seem very strong to me when I'm there. And I'm walking down streets and imagining my grandparents, the Balakians' lives, prosperous industrialists living in the Scutari section of Istanbul at the beginning of the 20th century, and then everything is gone. They're all exiled. All their wealth is confiscated. And you know, these things are running through you every minute you're there, really. So there's a sense of hauntedness. The same with my return to Aleppo. And I have written, I have a poem about returning to Istanbul. I don't know if you want me to read it. All right, this is returning to, it's called Coming to Istanbul. Coming to Istanbul. This is in my new book. Follow the gaze of Athena down a cistern where water glows. Follow silver snakes along Marmara and Golden Horn. Walk over the black plaque of Hrant Dink smack in the street in Shishli. Follow the ferry waves of Uskadar where your father was born, where your uncle returned incognito from prison. Drink the split bourbon voice of Ray Charles in the cafe in Taksim, under the red flags of star and moon, guns to the head, wild prayer, streets banging with pots and pans, rage at the dictator. Walk by in oblivion and terror, an American, an Armenian, black shirt under the olive trellised restaurant, hotel rooftop light rinsed Bosphorus, hot rocky fumes in the throat under the wind umbrellas and boutique glass facades of Beyoğlu, galleries of blue mosaics, magenta carpets. The Ottoman historian pours you tan and wine into the sunset. Follow the lights on the bridge into the chandelier of the sky, trompe l'oeil of gray wolves, voices of Turkish friends in the stone. Follow ghost signs, midnight cab smashed cafe windows, night sea journey of beloveds, Byzantine dirt smoke roads, past tobacco Reggie and Sultana crates, Haidar Pasha of Armenian soul death hour. Lost family, come greet me in your city.
Thank you, Peter. My next question ties to the cultural destruction aspect of your work. You addressed it a little bit earlier. You've also done some scholarly work on this, cultural destruction, Raphael Lemkin, and it is one of those themes that are also very much part of the conversation today in this country. Would you like to speak to that?
You know, I think Hachig, one of the understudied and focused on elements of genocide is the destruction of culture. That is the destruction of the targeted ethnic groups, cultural institutions, their buildings, their schools, their cultural producers, their artists, their writers, their clergy, their teachers, and their books and their manuscripts. Here we are in one of the great houses of culture in the United States, the Library of Congress. Imagine were this building destroyed in an act of ethnic cleansing or massacre or genocide. We wouldn't we wouldn't forget that this was a part of the deed that was being articulated. So I think that it's very important that we focus on the destruction of culture as a component of genocide. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish legal scholar who coined the term and concept of genocide as a crime in international law, wanted that to be in the definition in the UN Genocide Convention. It didn't quite make it into the official definition, but it's out there to be worked with on legal fronts. And I think as we look at the legacies of destruction of African Americans in the United States, of Native Americans in the United States, as we look at the cultural destruction of Bosnian Muslims in the former Yugoslavia, as we look at the cultural destruction of many groups around the world, the Tibetans, we have to focus on the dimension of the materiality of culture, because it too is an inseparable component of the identity of the ethnic group that is being targeted. So I feel that in the Armenian case, if we look at the landscape of Turkey today, we see the remains of over 2,000 churches, over 2,000 schools. The destruction of Armenian civilization is very much part of the meaning and significance of the Armenian Genocide.
We're sitting here in U.S. Poet Laureate's office, and in her memoir, U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo refers to the practice of poetry as a tool for justice. In your memoir, when you talk about your grandmother and her experience, you underscore how she never had this sense of closure and an injustice. And let me read this paragraph from that section. You say, "The fact remains that there was no one then to listen. There was no social movement or political context in which she and other survivors could be heard. Her fate was the fate of Armenia in the first part of the century. I imagine that when she came to acknowledge that there would be no justice, no condolence, no reparation, my grandmother must have been laden with rage and unfathomable grief." Now, here today in this moment, right, much has changed in terms of both the Armenian experience 3 generations later, through activism, through engagement. We're across the street from Capitol Hill, where US Congress has recognized the genocide in recent years, reaffirmed the genocide, and last year President Biden did so. Can you reflect on this connection between the past and the present and justice?
Yeah, first, thank you. First, I want to note that my grandmother did something extraordinary as a 25-year-old woman with 2 toddler daughters. She filed a lawsuit in the United States against the Turkish government through the US State Department, claims against foreign governments. The lawsuit was filed and it went into State Department records. It wasn't acted upon, but she actually tried to use the legal system to pursue justice on her own. One voice in the wilderness doing that. Now, that passage you read from my memoir is contextualized as the aftermath to her lawsuit. But as you say, Khachik, we are in a different culture today. I think that in the last quarter of the 20th century, American culture entered into a new era of human rights. And I really do believe historically this is true. And it was propelled by African American civil rights movement. And I also think the second wave of feminism. And I think it was propelled by the beginning impact of the aftermath of the Holocaust on genocide studies awareness. And we have moved forward over the last 4 decades in this culture of human rights in which notions of justice, restitution, and reparation are being pursued by many cultures in America and globally. And I think Armenians have now taken their place on a world arena in which slowly the Armenian community worldwide, including the Republic of Armenia, is engaged in a conversation about restitution and repair. And I think it's a sign of hope. There's a long way to go. The conditions inside the perpetrator's legacy regimes in Turkey today is not favorable, because Turkey is not a democracy in a full sense. But I think we have a kind of cultural moment that's so different from the cultural moment of the first quarter of the 20th century. So we can look back over 100 years and we can see signs of change and enormous affirmation and growth. In the Armenian case, toward the fuller realization of articulating this history as a discourse in a wider global arena. And I think that our culture has benefited from enormous energy from African American culture, Jewish diasporan culture, Native American culture. And I think these synergies matter deeply because human rights atrocities have to be dealt with properly for real democracies to exist.
Let's conclude with, again, going back to your experience with your grandmother. But this time not in the court of law, not in terms of, in the context of justice in that regard, but in the kitchen. Your poetry, particularly in No Sign, you have several poems that tackle this issue, and I know that the kitchen is also a place that's near and dear to you for a number of reasons. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, there's so much to say about what goes on in the kitchen because cultures are transmitted in the kitchen. Cooking and recipes, dining, feasting, dining, eating, all become modes of communion that's cultural as well as personal. And I've written a good bit about food and Armenian food and all kinds of food in various forms, in prose and poems. So maybe I'll close with this poem from my new book. I have a section of odes or meditations on fruits and vegetables. And this poem, Eggplant, it's really about my mother's in the kitchen in this poem. And my mother at 95 is still cooking in the kitchen. The kitchen is her passion. But my grandmother, but the Armenian Death March experience is evoked in the poem, as you'll see. And this is called Eggplant. I loved the white moon circles and the purple halos on a plate as the salt sweat them. The oil in the pan smoked like bad days in the Syrian desert, when a moon stayed all day, when morning was a purple elegy for the last friend seen, when the fog of the riverbank rose like a holy ghost. My mother made those white moons sizzle in some egg wash and salt. Some parsley appeared from the garden, and summer evenings came with no memory, but the table with white dishes. Shining aubergine, black-skinned beauty, bitter apple. We used our hands.
Thank you everyone for joining us for this program, Cultural Erasure, Witness and the Poet, a conversation and reading with poet Peter Balakian, organized by the African and Middle Eastern Division at the Library of Congress. To learn more about the African and Middle Eastern Division, please visit our website, loc.gov/RR/AMED. Thank you.